Welcome to Tangents, a podcast based on a series of odd conversations between two friends. As the British general elections on the 8th of June draw ever closer, Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May retains at latest polling a 7-point lead over her Labour opposition Jeremy Corbyn. The Labour Party has a storied history in British politics, beginning towards the start of the 20th century, and yet today is faced with a great period of crisis. I'm joined by someone who knows quite a bit about this storied history, as well as the current crisis today, my good friend Thomas. Hello, Thomas.
Hello, Josh.
So, Thomas, I recognize that making a prediction at this point is a little like offering your neck to the proverbial headsman, but
I'll say.
Why is the Labour Party doing so poorly? What are the current situations, and why is this so bad for British democracy?
Well, I would assert that the Labour Party is fundamentally an industrial political party. And Britain is increasingly a post-industrial society. Like many other parties of the center-left in the Western world, I'd say the Labour Party faces a modernization dilemma as it tries to move beyond its old industrial base of support and get new supporters, whether in identity movements or movements for the environment and so on, or among the service sector middle class. It seems to alienate its old supporters, and this makes it harder for it to come to power or to maintain power.
So, Thomas, how did we get here? What's the history behind the foundation of the Labour Party? How was it really constituted in the beginning, and how has it sort of changed over time?
So I would say the Labour Party begins with two things. The first is the Industrial Revolution and the transformative effect it had on British society. And the second is the expansion of franchise to all men and eventually all women in British society. So listeners will know that the Industrial Revolution generated really abysmal conditions for workers in factories, that it started first in Britain and expanded to the rest of the world. So there was a long Industrial Revolution in Britain going back from the 18th century well into the 20th. By the end of the 19th century, workers began to organize around the principles of democratic socialism, which took the ideas of Karl Marx that asserted that the industrial proletariat had certain interests that were opposed to the bourgeoisie, those who owned the ownership of the means of production, but insisted on using bourgeois democratic institutions and using the British Parliament to advance these reforms. Thus, it was the case in the year 1900 that the Labour Party, as we know it, was constituted under the leadership of Keir Hardie. Upon this foundation, the Labour Party immediately began to upset the British party system as it had existed for more than 200 years. At the time, the two leading political parties in Britain were the Conservatives, which represented the old landed aristocracy, and the Liberals, which represented the commercial middle class. As the vote was given to all adult men and adult women in their late 20s, Labour quickly began to gain seats in Parliament. By 1924, just after the First World War, the first Labour Prime Minister was put into office, Ramsay MacDonald. He didn't have a majority and he had to cooperate with other parties. The Labour Party immediately saw splits and the government quickly fell. MacDonald formed another government in the 1930s in the midst of the Great Depression, which was obviously brought pretty awful conditions for the British working class, but that government didn't last either. So the MacDonald government collapsed, and the Conservatives re-entered office. But as listeners know, the international situation in Europe entered crisis. Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, and Britons found themselves at war. Labour entered an all-party national government with the Liberals and Conservatives, led, of course, by Winston Churchill, through the duration of the Second World War. Now, we don't really need to rehash the events of World War II for this podcast. I think listeners will have some familiarity with that. But it's worth dwelling on the immense social changes that the Second World War brought upon British society. I will honestly say here that I don't think there's been a single historical event since the Black Plague, the Black Death, that has had a more dramatic impact on British society than the Second World War. The class system in the country, which originated over 1,000 years ago, the system of aristocracy, the system of the middle classes, the system of deference that the working classes held toward their betters, quote unquote, really began to break down in a profound way during the Second World War as the Luftwaffe bombed mostly working class areas of cities to the ground, as civilians were dying in the tens of thousands. British society changed in immense ways.
So would you say that the impacts of World War II were predominantly class-based in Britain then?
Well, there were a lot of impacts, but
naturally.
particularly for the political system, though, yes, the impact was class-based. The idea of deference that the working class had toward other parts of society really collapsed, and the foundations were set for a big transformation after the Second World War.
What about after World War II? How did the Labour Party transform Britain and really change itself after World War II?
Well, the changes were immense. On the 5th of July, 1945, to the surprise of the world, especially Stalin, Winston Churchill was defeated for re-election. Labour swept to a landslide in Parliament as the working classes en masse supported Labour in a way they never had before. Now the Labour Party could really govern on its own. It could bring its platform to bear in full. The main blueprint that was set out for Labour that it attempted to implement after World War II is called the Beveridge Report. This is one of the most important policy documents written in any Western country in the 20th century. The Beveridge Report sought to totally redesign society, to eliminate poverty, to eliminate want, to eliminate hunger, to provide, in other words, a basis that the state would provide for all people in society.
So you're telling me that it's not, in fact, a report of the various beverages that were consumed by the Labour Party?
No, or the rest of the classes at the time. I think.
I see. So it's not the gin
and ale were quite popular then.
It's not the world's first piece of legislation mandated the consumption of craft beer. Got it.
No,
okay.
No, it wasn't. But the Beveridge Report set the blueprint for Labour's big economic and social policies after the war. I would divide them in two. I would say the first is what I'd call the commanding heights. I'm naming this after an early 2000s book by Daniel Yergin. And the second and most important is welfare. So first, the commanding heights. The commanding heights was the mass nationalization of industry and extraction, of steel, of coal, of petroleum, of automotives, utilities. All of these were brought under state ownership, about 20% of the economy. All of the workers in these factories were now state employees. This really wasn't a dramatic step given the immense role that the British state played during the Second World War. It was only logical that in peacetime that this immense role that the state played in the economy would continue.
Yes,
so that was the first piece of the Labour government.
Yes, but by changing from a wartime, by continuing a wartime norm into peacetime, essentially what the Labour Party did was more socialized Britain than it had been in previous eras of peacetime. There had never been anything like this in peacetime in British history. And frankly, this was a first in the Western world. This was the first real socialist government in British history. Public ownership was absolutely at the center. Okay. And what about welfare?
The second piece and the most important is welfare. And when I talk about welfare, I'm not just talking about unemployment insurance. I'm talking about the state caring for people through the whole of their lives.
Right.
We don't have time to go through every single social program that Labour put into place, but I'll go through the two most important ones that still survive today. The first is national insurance, which is just the British equivalent of Social Security. National insurance is a set of accounts that people pay into their entire lives that protect them from disability, from unemployment, and eventually in old age. This is the modern British pension system. The second and the most important piece of legislation that Labour puts into place, the most important piece of legislation that Labour has ever put into place, the most important piece of peacetime legislation in British history is the National Health Service.
Why is it so important, Thomas?
The National Health Service was really the world's first state-run health system. In 1948, the health secretary, Anarchy Bevan, put forward the National Health Act, which nationalized all hospitals, all private practices. It put all doctors as state employees, put them on general salaries, and critically put forward that all health services would henceforward be free at the point of use, and that they would be funded through general taxation. This had never been attempted before. It's worth mentioning that there really wasn't much of a health system for most British people at this point. There were charity hospitals for the poor, and there were private hospitals for the rich. But most people didn't have much access to health care through their lives. The life expectancy of people was, particularly people in the working class, was pretty low at this time. In the mid-40s, the life expectancy, and this is just astonishing, was in the 40s. Most people weren't living to reach 50 because they had no health care at this time.
That's insane.
Within just a few years, the life expectancy of British people went into the high 60s. It went up by 20 years because of this legislation.
Change.
It really is. It's worth mentioning, it's hard to explain to an American audience this, but the National Health Service ceased very quickly to become a labor policy. It became a British policy. And today there is no single institution in Britain, not the free press, not democracy, not the monarchy, nothing. Nothing has the level of approval, the level of reverence that the NHS did. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who wasn't as fond of the NHS as other British political leaders, would later say that this is our national religion. And note that Britain does have an established national religion. NHS is Britain's national religion. They see it as their great accomplishment. It's a part of their national identity that people can receive health care no matter what their circumstances. So Labour's in power. It puts in place all this vast social legislation at a time when Europe is attempting, when obviously Europe is being rebuilt, the Allies are still in Germany. Conditions are still pretty harsh for people. This period was known by one great British historian as austerity Britain. Rationing is still taking place during this time. Rationing is actually worse for British people after the Second World War than it is during the Second World War, because all foodstuffs are being sent to France and to Germany and to Eastern Europe to prevent
international
famine.
aid. Got it.
Yeah, it's a pretty dramatic time. So Labour's in power for 8 years. It puts in place all these policies, but it does eventually lose power in 1953. So Labour loses power in 1951. It achieved an immense amount in the 6 years that it was in power. I'm not going to say too much about the conservative governments that followed. Churchill comes back again, and then there's Eden and Macmillan and Hume. But the two critical things happen under these conservative administrations. The first is that they don't abandon the policies that are put in place under Labour. They actually maintain and even modestly expand some of these statist policies. This period of time is now known as the consensus period of British politics. There's a consensus on the state's role in the economy. There's a consensus on the need to use what's called Keynesian demand management, named after John Maynard Keynes, to keep unemployment low. This is a legacy of the Depression. So they keep all these policies in place. They keep the NHS. They keep nationalization. And they sort of assume a role of sort of patrician caretakers in British society.
Would you say that this is the period in which the difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party was perhaps the smallest that it's ever been?
Yes, I would. I think there's still a big difference in the social class of the people who support these parties. It's still mostly working class supporting Labour at this time, and the Labour class is, you know, the large industrial working class. They all have a lot in common, and it's still mostly the middle classes who are supporting the Conservatives, although, you know, a few working class people vote for Churchill. But there's a degree of consensus around the policies they pursue ideologically. There isn't a dramatic difference in this idea of the state's role in the economy. The second thing that happens that I would say is worth mentioning is that the Conservatives pretty badly mismanaged the country's finances, especially under Harold Macmillan's government. So the next time Labour comes to power, it's going to be a different situation as far as the public finances.
Well, why don't you tell us about the next time Labour comes into power? How does Labour transform Britain in the 1960s and 1970s? What is it when it comes back?
So in 1964, Labour has a new leader, Harold Wilson. He comes from the middle class. He went to a grammar school, which is a merit-based, state-funded institution.
Yes.
He seems to have a lot more charisma than his opponent, Alec Douglas Hume, who came from the House of Lords and had to renounce his title. So he comes into office, and he's still doing so on the basis of mostly working class support in these days. Just a fun fact, the same day that Labour comes back to power with a narrow majority in 1964 is the day that Nikita Khrushchev is deposed in the Soviet Union by Brezhnev. So that's the difference between democratic socialism and revolutionary socialism. Just a fun fact. So Labour comes back into power in 64, but the groups that might support it are starting to change. New social movements of the 1960s, what's called the New Left, starts agitating for reforms beyond just economic justice for the working class. The New Left includes environmentalists, feminists, anti-war activists, and Labour responds to a modest degree with a new set of liberal small L social policies. The most important figure in this government under Harold Wilson is the Home Secretary. The Home Secretary is the most powerful cabinet position. It manages everything from the police to immigration and so on. The Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, puts into place a brand new set of social policies. Homosexuality is not a crime for the first time. Abortion becomes legal in certain circumstances for the first time. Regulations on divorce are relaxed. Right. So you start to see the government responding to changes in society. The other thing that happens, though, is that the industrial state, as it was put into place by Labour in the 40s, is starting to come undone. It's starting to enter decline. The nationalized industries, which Labour believed in the 40s would be under better management if they were controlled under the state, in fact, they become more inefficient. They produce less. They're unable to compete with Germany and Japan, which have now, and the United States, which have all fully recovered from the Second World War. And the government is running out of money that it needs to modernize them. And meanwhile, the workers within these industries who are represented by trade unions begin to radicalize. They begin to support extreme left-wing policies and to resist any attempt at reforming these nationalized industries that are pulling on the public finances. So when Labour tries even modestly to change it, they call strikes across the country and Labour's forced to give in. And this is eventually what leads to Labour losing power in 1970. The conservative government of Ted Heath that takes over in 70 has very much the same problem. Strikes get worse as the government attempts to reform particularly coal mines. And in 1974, Ted Heath asked the worst question you could ask when you're prime minister, who governs? He called the election, and people said, well, if you have to ask, mate, it's not you. And he lost the election, and Wilson comes back to power. Wilson's confronted with the same situation that he was before. By the mid-70s, the country is approaching almost industrial anarchy. Pretty much every section of the economy, trade unions are going on strike. The government runs out of money, especially during the oil crisis in the Middle East in the 70s. Britain becomes the first industrialized country to have to go to the IMF. I'm not kidding. It has to take on big loans from the United States. The economy enters recession. The country's really in a full-blown state of crisis. Most scholars of modern British history will say that the mid-1970s is pretty much the darkest moment in post-war British history. There were even some who questioned if British democracy could honestly survive. The government didn't seem to be in control of these radical union leaders as they continued to go on strike. So Harold Wilson leaves as prime minister, we now know due to Alzheimer's, and James Callaghan, his successor, a giant Welshman, well over 6 feet tall, he becomes prime minister. He's the most qualified prime minister in post-war history at the time. He's held almost every major cabinet position by this point. People think he's going to be successful, but he couldn't have inherited a worse situation. He seems pretty much unable to reform nationalized industries. And after Britain's going to the IMF for a loan, the IMF imposes conditions that will be known as monetarism, where Britain has to start to raise interest rates, where it can't pump money into the economy the same way that it had before to keep unemployment low. This is actually pretty amazing, because this is what we're eventually going to call Thatcherism, but this is happening at least in a modest degree under the Labour government. Right. So we're finally at this point to the winter of 1978 and early 1979. Mm-hmm. Callaghan has the option of calling an early general election, which he might have won, but instead opts to go on vacation to the Caribbean.
That's not a wise decision.
It was not a good decision. While he's on vacation in the Caribbean, pretty much the entire country goes on strike. The economy grinds to a halt. He comes back from the Caribbean, gets off the plane. A reporter asks him, Prime Minister, what do you think we're going to do about the present crisis? And he says, crisis? What crisis? And that's the end of his government. Margaret Thatcher is now leader of the Conservative Party. She runs on the most famous slogan, campaign slogan in post-war British history, a big billboard with a long dull line that says Labour isn't working. And of course the Conservatives sweep to power and push Labour out of power for the next 18 years.
So 18 years is quite a long while to be out of power. What happened to Labour during the wilderness period of the 1980s?
Well, British society undergoes immense transformations in the 1980s. This isn't a podcast about Thatcher, but we have to mention briefly what her policies were. So when she came to power, she initially had to fight off moderates within her own party. But eventually, Thatcher pursues two big economic changes that break the post-war consensus that I talked about. The first is the end of Keynesian demand management as we know it, of pumping money into the economy to keep unemployment low, and the beginning of what's called monetarism. This means both restricting the money supply, restricting pound sterling, which had been suffering from inflation, and raising interest rates. And this is at a time of recession. So unemployment goes through the roof, and it's especially working class people who are hit hard. The second policy she pursues is the privatization of these nationalized industries that Labour had put into state ownership in the late 40s. Labour is going to take one of three positions here. And it's at this point, this sort of three-point spectrum, if you will, is how I'm going to start describing the Labour Party from this point forward. The left of that spectrum is total resistance, total opposition. The middle of that spectrum is trying to muddle through and appease both groups, and the right of that spectrum is reform and ultimately acceptance of Thatcher's policies. So we're going to start with the left, and it's probably how we're going to finish this podcast too, sadly. The left is represented by Labour's new leader after Callaghan, Michael Foot, who is the most left-wing leader Labour has in the post-war 20th century period, at any rate.
Okay.
Foot resists all of Thatcher's policies. He resists privatization. He resists monetarism. He's more or less not able to give a response to the problems that Labour had in the 70s. He basically embraces the causes of the radical trade unions that are at war, and I'm not kidding, at war with Thatcher during this period. Thatcher, in her first term, ends up in a surprise war with Argentina, as our listeners will know, the Falklands War. And this is at a time when the British public's confidence in itself is pretty low. So Britain wins this war. It's a little war. Thatcher gains enormous popularity. She decides to go to the polls, to go to election in 1983. Labour under Foot puts a strong set of left-wing policies on its platform that year, which is known as the longest suicide note in history.
Is that because
Labour
the policies were unpopular?
They were very popular. This is critical. They were very popular with core Labour supporters. They were very popular in Northern England. They were very popular in Liverpool. They were very popular in parts of Wales and Scotland. They were not popular in Southern England. So, again, we can see the modernization dilemma at work here. We can see Labour trying to reach out to its core supporters, who, I should be clear, are really being affected in a profound way and a negative way by Thatcher's policies, and trying to reach out to the broader British public, which at this point largely supports Thatcher. So Labour's defeated in 83. It's worth mentioning two new MPs Labour MPs are among the few who were elected that year. One is Tony Blair, who we'll be talking about a lot, and the other is Jeremy Corbyn, the current leader. Two very different figures. They're both elected in 83, though. But Labour's defeated in 83, and it has to come up with a new position. The new leader, the Welshman Neil Kinnock, becomes the longest-serving opposition leader under Thatcher and her successor, John Major. He serves as opposition leader for 2 terms and gets to fight in 2 elections. He's kind of remembered by particularly right-wing British historians as another left-wing leader like Foote. I don't think this is accurate at all. I think Kinnock actually tried to take the middle of the road to the best degree possible he could between the very, very left-wing core of the Labour Party, which is in total resistance to Thatcher as she's trying to privatize coal mines and steel and so on, and the rest of the British public. He is mocked pretty horribly for this. There's a wonderful satire show, which I recommend looking up on YouTube during this period, called Spitting Image, which has basically British politicians depicted as puppets, and Kinnock is depicted one day as wearing a red tie and preaching the line of the trade unions, and the other day as wearing a blue tie on the opposite side of Parliament and preaching something similar to Thatcher's line. He was, on the whole, a pretty left-wing leader, but he did recognize the need for his party to modernize. I think he did about the best he could at the time. But Labour is defeated in 1987. This is Thatcher's last election as prime minister. It's also what I'd call Pax Thatcher. By this point, Thatcher's achieved her big aims of privatization and monetarism. At this point, the British economy has recovered, and Thatcher, in a different discussion, is playing a very crucial role in the end of the Cold War. So Thatcher is a very renowned international figure by 1987, and the Conservatives win. The period after 87 doesn't go too well for Thatcher. She starts to pursue a lot of unpopular policies, especially the hated poll tax, a reform of the council tax system in Britain, and her own party deposes her in the early 90s, and she's replaced by the much more affable and moderate figure, John Major. John Major is representative of a more moderate strain of the British Conservative Party, one that I think Theresa May, the current prime minister, would subscribe to. 1992 is a critical election year. This is the election that everybody thinks Labour is going to win. Labour, by this point, had been out of power for 13 years. It was just assumed that finally Labour, finally after the poll tax, finally after all of the problems that the Conservative Party's having, particularly over Europe, which is starting to become a big debate within the Conservative Party, that the Conservatives are finally going to lose, and a triumphant Labour Party can return to power and undo Thatcherism. That's not what happens.
No.
During the campaign, 2 things happen. First, John Major reveals himself as one of the most talented campaigners in British political history. He appeals to a segment of the Conservative Party that might have felt a little bit alienated under Thatcher, the small C social conservatives of village England, older voters who remember Britain before World War II. They come over to John Major's side. And Neil Kinnock takes on a very triumphalist attitude during this. During a notable speech he gave, he comes in front of a cheering crowd of Labour Party supporters and yells, "You're all right, you're all right, you're all right." It sounds like an American-style election rally, which doesn't go over well in Middle England.
No.
This is seen as a very un-British way of campaigning, a very un-prime ministerial way of campaigning.
Would you say that Kinnock was was treating it more like a coronation as opposed to a campaign?
I think I would say that. It really did feel like that, particularly among Labour voters who felt like they really were about to win. And Labour, the polls critically, and I'm going to talk about this more in the context of the current election, the polls overestimate Labour in this 1992 election. They say that Labour is going to win. Everybody thinks that that's the case. We discover later on that there were working class supporters, working class people who said they were going to vote Labour and actually voted Conservative and would henceforth be called the shy Tories. They didn't want to admit that they were going to vote Conservative in this election campaign. Notably, right before the election, the populist newspaper, the tabloid The Sun, has a headline that says, if Labour wins the election, will the last person in Britain please turn out the lights? Everyone thinks that Kinnock is about to become prime minister and undo Thatcherism, and John Major wins a narrow majority to the astonishment of especially Labour and the rest of the country. So by this point, Labour has now lost 4 straight elections.
So 4 consecutive election defeats. What position, what sort of condition is the Labour Party in after this latest failure?
Shell-shocked. This was not a defeat they expected. I mentioned a lot of Kinnock's problems during the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
The real reason we know why they lost the election was this modernization dilemma. They couldn't expand beyond their core vote. It was the policies that they put forward in the campaign. And finally, at this point, after these 4 defeats, many within the party are starting to realize that. They select a new sort of middle-of-the-road leader after the campaign, John Smith, who I actually think would have made a great prime minister. John Smith was a wonderful personality in British politics, but he died unexpectedly not long after becoming leader. And Tony Blair, who I mentioned had been elected in '83, was finally in a position to take over the leadership of the Labour Party. Blair and a group of MPs within Labour who were to the right. This includes figures like Peter Mandelson, Alistair Campbell, and to a lesser extent, Gordon Brown, who would be an ally, a sometimes ally of Tony Blair, begin to advocate for really reforming the whole position of the Labour Party.
Right.
So in 1994, Labour holds a leadership contest. Blair sweeps to power as leader on a platform to reform the party, and immediately proceeds to do so upon becoming leader. Mm-hmm. In 1995, Labour holds a special conference where they revoke the so-called Clause 4 of the party's constitution, which asserts the party's commitment to public ownership, to mass nationalization of the economy. This is a core principle of democratic socialism.
Right.
And it's at this point that many say that the Labour Party ceased to be a really democratic socialist political party. Okay. I think that's debatable to an extent, but it's certainly the case that at this point, public ownership, and I would say this is still basically true even under Jeremy Corbyn, public ownership ceases to be a major part of Labour's platform, and it starts to become more, in Blair's eyes, a center-left progressive political party. The new platform of the party, which is called New Labour, New Britain, and New Labour will be what Labour refers to itself as under Blair, starts to talk less about equality and more about opportunity, more about the so-called aspirational classes, as they're called. Who are these people? These are people who work in the service sector, people who live in southeast England and in London, people who might have backed the Conservatives during the 80s and early 90s. Labour is finally reaching out beyond its traditional base of support, and it couldn't have come at a better time. John Major's government is now in a full-blown civil war over the European Union. This is right around the time of the Maastricht Treaty, when the EU is preparing to adopt a single currency. Britain obviously opts out of the single currency, but many members of the Conservative Party, taking their cues from Thatcher, who is leaving, at the end of her time in office, are opposing the EU really altogether on a sort of nationalist stand. Major and his government support the EU. So there's immense infighting going on within the Conservative Party, and it's pretty disastrous. The Conservative Party also appears to be really out of step on social policies throughout the country, and Blair takes on these sort of new left social causes, among them the idea of civil partnerships for gay couples in Britain, and starts to depict himself as sort of the figure of the 21st century. So the Conservative government runs its course, and in the spring of 1997, they call a general election. Labour sweeps to victory in this election. It's the biggest landslide victory in Labour's history. They get over 400 seats in Parliament. It's even bigger than Labour's landslide victory in 1945.
I was about to ask that.
Yeah, it's pretty astonishing. I think I have the figure here. I believe it's 411 seats that Labour wins in this election. That's pretty astonishing.
That's a lot.
So you have it seems, at least for the moment, that the idea of modernizing the party has paid off. What I would say about this is that you had a lot of different – this is a parliamentary system, not a presidential system.
Right.
You had a lot of different candidates running in different places under a different set of ideas. You did indeed have moderate or centrist Labour Party candidates running in Southeast England who won in this election on a Blairite platform, but you still had people in the old northern constituencies, the left-wing Labour figures of old, people like Dennis Skinner, like Diane Abbott, still figures in the Labour Party today who are running on the old-time religion, the ideas of immense state intervention in the economy, of democratic socialism, of equality, many of them very uncomfortable with the changes that the Labour Party is making. So you can already start to see the seeds of division within Labour, even at this time of its triumphant victory. But for the moment, Labour's in power. Blair gives an immense speech before thousands of supporters saying, Britain voted for change tonight. We're going to make this country as proud of us as we can. And Labour is able to make fundamental changes and seem to put its progressive policies into action.
So this sort of transcendental sweeping change that Tony Blair really brought to Labour would presumably indicate that a continuation of that same change when Blair was in power. How was Tony Blair as Prime Minister?
So I would say he was not as transformative as Thatcher was. He exercised caution outside of foreign policy. He exercised caution through a good deal of his premiership on the types of social policies to pursue. He did have some pretty significant accomplishments, and I think and I'm talking on domestic policy,
okay.
And I think it's worth going through those.
Sure.
Labour put in place a minimum wage for the first time in British history. Yes, this is 1997, and Britain didn't have a minimum wage yet. It's worth reminding listeners that when a developed state doesn't have a minimum wage, it doesn't mean people are being paid 15 cents or 15 pence an hour for their work. It just means that they're being paid the equilibrium wage, which in a developed country is still going to be a lot higher than in a developed country, will still be higher than in a developing country. But the minimum wage did mean a lot more money going to working class people for the first time, as did a system of tax credits that he helped put in place. These were based on the earned income tax credit in the U.S. They played an enormous role in improving the lot of working people in Britain. He, to some degree, improved the quality of public services. I think this record is more mixed and controversial, but it really is the case that the Conservatives defunded the National Health Service. Lines were pretty horrifically long. The quality of service was below that of other countries for many types of medical procedures. Labour put in a lot more money into it. It initially pursued a bad system of targets, which were designed to reduce wait times in the state-run system. This didn't fare as well because doctors more or less did everything they could to make it look like they were meeting their targets when they actually weren't, including making it apparently giving medical care to dead people, among other things. But eventually he moved more toward a quasi-competitive system, the idea of a market within a state-run system that saw the quality of services improve. Today, wait times are much, much less for the National Health Service than they were in the 80s and 90s. So that quality of care that quality service has improved a lot. He put in place a universal pre-K program called Sure Start, which American listeners will know is the equivalent of Head Start program. That really helped poor people a lot. So there was a lot of progressive legislation that he put in place that was designed to help poor people. This is not the equivalent of renationalizing the economy. This is not undoing Thatcherism. Blair accepted privatization, as I mentioned, with revoking Clause 4, but he did put in place some progressive policies.
What about some of his less progressive policies?
Well, quickly, I want to mention that there were also constitutional changes that he put into place. So Wales and Scotland, for the first time, got something close to home rule. This is called devolution. So Wales and Scotland got their own parliaments, and this sort of sets the stage for the rise of the Scottish National Party. Northern Ireland had peace. This is probably Blair's signature accomplishment more than anything else, was the peace deal in Northern Ireland. And that was a pretty dramatic accomplishment. But I would say, you were asking about his less progressive policies.
Yes.
This kind of comes down to my thesis about the effect of globalization on British society. Blair was a champion of globalization. He once said of globalization that having a debate about globalization is like debating whether autumn should follow summer. In other words, there really is no debate about globalization. It's happening.
It was
and
an
he
accepted
said
fact. Right.
it was an accepted fact, and we can debate on whether or not that's true. But from his point of view, and more importantly from the point of view of core labor supporters, this is a labor prime minister that's embracing a set of global trends that are hurting them. Mm-hmm. And he said that of globalization, that the only thing that works is an open liberal economy, which he embraced in full. He embraced free trade. He embraced integration in Europe. He at one point flirted with the idea of joining the euro, although that thankfully didn't happen. So this was a champion of globalization at the head of a center-left party, and I think set the stage for the alienation that would happen later on. The other less progressive policy, and the most obvious one that we know of, is the Iraq War. There is no single policy that alienated more people from the Labor Party, and not just the left of the party, but really all of the party, than Blair's decision to be involved in the war of Iraq. He was the most visibly public figure, the most visibly public supporter of the war in Iraq next to George W. Bush.
He was the head of the coalition of the willing.
He was the head of the coalition of the willing. Britain played a key role, you'll remember, in the faulty intelligence that led up to the war. Blair gave a much publicized speech in Parliament, insisting that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He gave full-throated support through the war for its entirety, through the initial build-up to the war, to the invasion, and critically to the aftermath, which went so poorly. Now, the Labour Party, many sections of it, not just the new left, where the anti-war movement is so prominent, but even in the old left, going back to Labour's opposite, to the support of many in the Labour Party to the First World War, and even the support in some of the Labour Party to the Second World War. Opposing war has a long tradition on the political left in Britain, one that I don't think quite exists in the U.S. And supporting this war in particular proved to be immensely alienating to large sections of the Labour Party and is critical to Blair's immense unpopularity later. But Blair did win re-election in 2001 before the war, and he did manage to win re-election in 2005, even after the war in Iraq was underway, largely because the Conservative Party was still in pretty poor shape at this time. But by 2007, the war in Iraq was at a pretty low point. A sectarian civil war had broken out between Sunnis and Shiites. Blair himself was immensely unpopular and finally left office in 2007 and was succeeded by his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown. So the government of New Labour didn't exactly go as expected. It certainly didn't end the way Blair had expected. He entered office with the support of large segments of British society, but by the time he left, he had succeeded both in alienating the service sector middle classes, who he had tried to bring into the party, and his core base of support, both on the old left and the new left. And the party has never really regained that support since. And it didn't, and it was not able to do so under the next three leaders of the party.
So you mentioned Gordon Brown succeeded Tony Blair. Was Gordon Brown a successful or an unsuccessful prime minister?
He was extremely unsuccessful. Gordon Brown had never been a full-throated supporter of New Labour. I think during the 97 campaign, he actually was never recorded saying the phrase New Labour. He simply said this Labour Party. He was a great politician in his time, but he had a lot of personality flaws as well, which became apparent when he was prime minister. Right. But when he entered office in 2007, a lot of these old Labour supporters thought it was a breath of fresh air. They thought they were getting a quote-unquote real Labour prime minister, someone who was more to the left of Tony Blair. They didn't really get what they wanted. Brown entered office quite popular. There was, and I don't want to undermine the tragedy of this, but there was a terrorist attack in 2007. This is not as big as the terrorist attacks of 2005 on July 7th, 2005. Bombers? The 7/7 bombers were in 2005.
2005.
There was a smaller terrorist attack just after Brown entered office in 2007, I believe, at the Heathrow airport, and Brown responded pretty swiftly and saw his popularity surge. At this point, he was faced with a question. Does he call an early election just 2 years after Labour had gone to the polls before, which he might have a chance of winning, or does he continue to govern as an unelected prime minister? He famously waffled on this, first looking like he was about to call an election, but he ultimately didn't call an election, and this pretty much sapped away his authority for the remainder of his time as prime minister. He saw several policy failures pretty quickly, including a disastrous attempt to raise the maximum income tax rate to 50%, the so-called 50p debacle. And one MP in a famous parliamentary exchange, the Liberal Democrat Vince Cable, said that the prime minister has gone in a few months from Stalin to Mr. Bean. This is probably the most legendary put-down of the 21st century. Brown looked pretty much like an idiot. It was, if you watch this video, it was a pretty humiliating scene. Brown didn't really achieve most of his signature policy aims during his time in office, and events started to pick up, and the government was only left to respond to them. There are two really dramatic events that are worth mentioning that occurred under the Brown premiership. The first and the most obvious is the 2008 financial crisis. The City of London is, I think, other than Wall Street, the world's financial center, and this role for the City of London grew very much during the Blair years, when Gordon Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer or Finance Minister. There wasn't much oversight of big finance as speculation into construction and housing grew during the early and mid-2000s. Gordon Brown famously said at the height of the growth of the mid-2000s, and this was repeated 1,000 times after, that we have eliminated boom and bust. This, you can imagine that they took this noose and they hung him with it very much. This was repeated countless times after the economy crashed. So obviously all the speculation led to the crisis. British banks were saddled with mortgage debt. The government was forced to do a very unpopular bailout policy as the economy was jumping into recession, and this just further alienated the electorate from the Labour government. I think if Prime Minister Brown were with us today, he would say that this was his best moment as Prime Minister, that this was probably his greatest achievement, was averting the Great Depression, and that this policy was mimicked in other countries, that this led into the bailouts that occurred in the U.S., supporting the financial system in a way that didn't occur in the 1930s. I think he's right. He would be right to say that, because really, if they hadn't shored up the financial system, there would have been banking collapses, and we don't know what would have happened to the global economy. But Barack Obama, who was elected president not long after this, famously observed of averting financial catastrophe, that you're not going to be given credit for what didn't happen under your administration. And the same he said for Brown. He was given no credit for this. Instead, he was at the receiving end of immense public anger as CEOs in the financial sector received huge bonuses just after they had taken public money. No credit at all for this policy. The other big thing that happened under the Brown years is the biggest political scandal in modern British history, known as MPs' expenses. The MPs' expense system is just a system through which parliamentarians are reimbursed for the cost of being in politics, particularly for MPs who don't live in London. They get reimbursed for travel expenses. They get reimbursed for flats or apartments that they live in when they're in London representing their constituents in Parliament. But this system was largely secret up until 2008. A newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, went to court to get this published under the Freedom of Information Act. The British also have a Freedom of Information Act, just as we do here. And they won that case at the High Court in 2008. And beginning in 2009, they started to publish accounts of these expenses. And it revealed a system rife with abuse. Parliamentarians in all parties were using the expense system for things that they just shouldn't have been. Some examples included second homes they didn't live in, lavish meals. In the case of one MP, he used public money, I'm not kidding, to make a moat outside of his mansion. So that's the type of thing that the public was reading in the newspaper as the economy was in a deep recession after bankers in the financial sector had just received huge compensation after bringing the economy to the brink. You can imagine the populist anger that this instilled, the violation of the sense of fair play that you and I will talk about a lot more in modern politics that occurred after this scandal. MPs received death threats. The Speaker of the House of Commons, Michael Martin, was forced to resign as a result of this expense. And at the center of all of this, who's in government but Gordon Brown?
Of course. So after Brown lost all of this popularity and all these crises and various different scandals happened, what happens to Labor in the 2010 election?
Well, they lose.
Of course.
It's not a surprise. Brown regained a little bit of popularity toward the spring of 2010 when the election was called, but it wasn't nearly enough to save him. Labor only manages to hold on to its core areas. Critically, Brown does just well enough to deny David Cameron, the Conservative Party leader, a majority in Parliament, and Cameron is forced to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, a smaller party.
Right.
But Labor is defeated, and the party after the election is forced to come to terms with the Blair-Brown years. Does it move on, or does it stand unapologetic toward the Blair-Brown years? And I think there's honestly something analogous here to the party's position in the 80s. You kind of have, on the one hand, a right of the party, which wants to embrace Blair and this time in office and keep the party's moderate position. You have a middle, which wants to try to appease both groups and chart a new course, perhaps, unconvincingly. And you have a left, which unapologetically opposes it. So in something straight out of a Jeffrey Archer novel, two brothers compete against each other for the leadership of the Labor Party after the 2010 election. David Miliband was everyone's favorite to win leadership of the Labor Party. He was foreign secretary under Gordon Brown, an extremely charismatic figure, and the son of a veteran labor figure, Ralph Miliband. His younger brother, Ed, who was energy minister under Gordon Brown, is to the left of David. And they're the two frontrunners to compete for the party. The party has an odd leadership selection system by this point, a system which consists both in three ways of members of parliament, of what's called affiliated organizations, which is trade unions, and of Labor Party members. The MPs, the members of parliament, overwhelmingly back David Miliband. They think that he's clearly the most dynamic figure within the party, who can lead the party out of the wilderness, who can convincingly oppose David Cameron's government and return Labor to power. But the unions and the activists back Ed, Red Ed, who's seen, at least at the time, as being a pretty left-wing figure. I would assert, and what we see, is that Red Ed is actually pretty centrist for the party. He tries to chart this middle course. He doesn't use the word New Labor. That's gone at this point. He admits that the party was wrong about immigration. There was a lot of immigration during Blair's time in office, which is unpopular with the grassroots. And he tries to chart a middle road over the increasing debate about Europe that's occurring under the Cameron years.
Right.
Of course, just like Neil Kinnock before him, by staying in the middle, he doesn't really please anybody.
No.
His pet issues that he picks on are non-domicile tax avoidance, the so-called non-doms. I'm pretty sure no listener outside of Britain has ever heard of this policy, and many within Britain have probably never heard of this policy or cares much about it. He picks on the government for instituting a so-called bedroom tax policy, which under the conservative government, which fails but doesn't really inspire many people. And by the time and during this time, a set of earthquakes are underway in British politics that Labour is sort of unresponsive to. So Scotland's going to be the first, and we're going to talk about Scotland more in a different episode. The Scottish National Party in 2007 got a majority in 2011, the Scottish National Party got a majority in the Scottish Parliament, and they were now able to vote for an independence referendum for Scotland from the United Kingdom, which took place in the fall of 2014. This is in Labour's heartland. Miliband, of course, is in the Labour Party, which favors the Union. He doesn't cooperate well with Cameron and the Liberal Democrats, who also favor the Union during this referendum campaign. And the Scottish National Party, which is standing on their own, does lose this campaign. But a radicalization occurs within Scotland. At this point, core Labour supporters break with the party, many of them voting for independence, and many of them leave the Labour Party and join the Scottish National Party. This is going to become increasingly clear as the 2015 election approaches. Now, in the 2015 election, and this is going to sound very familiar, the polls are actually predicting Ed Miliband might win narrowly. Probably a minority government, but that he might win.
Right.
This does not happen. David Cameron wins a majority. The Liberal Democrats are more or less put to oblivion in this election. And critically, the Labour Party is destroyed. It's destroyed across southern England. It's destroyed across the Midlands. It's destroyed in Scotland, where the Scottish National Party sweeps 50 of 53 seats. Labour suffers its worst defeat in 2015 than it has in more than 100 years. Miliband's strategy of towing the middle line has failed. Core Labour voters have left the party fully alienated by this point after years of recession and as new populist winds are sweeping throughout the Western world.
And perhaps most importantly, this middle ground policy failed to earn any new voters for Labour that they didn't already previously have.
It didn't.
No, it's a complete and total failure.
Yeah, the party can't seem either to gain credibility with new voters who are in the service sector who benefit from globalization, or with its old constituents, I would say, in places where there are other choices. So in Scotland, the Scottish National Party was a clear alternative to Labour. It took on a real left-wing populism under its then leader, Nicola Sturgeon. In Northern England, where there aren't many other choices, Labour still manages to hold on. And again, this is the parliamentary system at work, unapologetic left-wing Labour MPs who manage to hold on to their seats. So the Labour Party that returns after the 2015 election is a core of more left-wing supporters and a demoralized set of moderates, and in the grassroots, a much more radically left-wing group of supporters.
So, Thomas, what are you bringing to the intellectual buffet today?
Well, I've got three things.
Okay.
I want to start with some remarks that Angela Merkel made, I believe, in the southern state of Bavaria at a campaign event for her Christian Democrats and the Christian Social Union, which is the Bavarian equivalent, on May 28th. She said, among other things, and this was after her ill-fated meeting with Trump at the G7, that Europe must take our fate into our own hands. The times in which we could fully rely on others, they're somewhat over. This is what I experienced in the last few days. We have to know that we must fight for our own future and for our destiny as Europeans. This is a pretty dramatic statement from someone who is not known to speak off the cuff, and it follows a number of high-profile disagreements that President Trump has had with European leaders, especially Merkel, notably over Article 5 of NATO, which Trump has still refused to publicly endorse. Apparently there was an endorsement in the original text of the speech.
Yes,
but
there was.
In the spoken version of the speech, the president refused to give the endorsement. And I also should mention, just as a coincidence, that Steve Bannon was on that trip.
Steve Bannon was on that trip.
He was
our
on
listeners may know that Bannon is very against the Article 5 endorsement until other members of NATO decide to, quote, pay their fair share. Also, it's worth pointing out that H.R. McMaster, Trump's national security advisor, and Mattis, his Secretary of Defense, both stated that there would be an Article 5 endorsement in Trump's speech.
Yeah, and this idea of Europeans paying more for defense, which I just want to publicly say I absolutely think European countries need to put more money into defense.
Agreed.
The world would be a safer place if more democracies are engaging more in foreign policy and spending more of their GDP on defense. They can make a much more meaningful contribution if they do so.
Yeah.
That's not a bad thing.
No.
The dramatic and U.S. leaders, including Barack Obama, have said this before. Europeans spend more money on defense. That's fine.
Yes.
It's the fact that it is contingent on this Article 5 endorsement that is so dramatic, that is such a departure from U.S. policy over 70 years. And Merkel's comments came in the wake of that, and also with, at that time, the disagreement over the Paris Climate Accord, which, of course, Trump pulled out of just a few days later. So this is dramatic both for Europe and for the United States. For Europe, it means beginning to set out a policy independent of the U.S. for the first time since the Second World War. One commentator noted at this time that today the United States is heading a direction in key issues that seems to be diametrically opposite of where Europe is heading, and Merkel's comments are an acknowledgement of that new reality. So we should be looking out for what a new European policy, independent of the United States, and more importantly, what means they can put to support that policy. Is it a European army? What is it? So we should be looking out for that. But the other thing is just this means the U.S. is not as interested in global leadership as it has been in 70 years. This is really astonishing. This would make a great topic for our podcast by itself. And I'm sure we'll be discussing it more in the months to come. But next thing I've got...
Thomas.
Yeah.
Quick question.
Sure.
Do you think Donald Trump means to make America great again by reverting back to 1945, where Russia are our friends and Germany are our enemies?
I think there are people around him who are thinking in that direction. I don't know that they would necessarily think of 1945, because it's worth saying in 1945, many other countries in Europe were our close allies. We were aligned with Britain. We were aligned with France. We were aligned with dozens and dozens of other countries around the world. We wouldn't have won the Second World War without the help of the Soviet Union.
Of course not.
But the global force against the not the Central Powers, the Axis powers, consisted of dozens and dozens of other countries. This force was known, this is not well remembered, but it was called the United Nations, which is the name of the international organization today that Trump and lately his ambassador, Nikki Haley, are so decrying. It's a great events happening at the UN. Sadly, we don't have time to discuss today. So I don't think the comparison to 1945 holds up, because it was multilateralism, it was engagement that won us the Second World War. It was recognizing common interests that we have with other countries. But I want to come back to the U.S. I want to come back to the U.S. for my next point. A book by the scholar Richard Reeves, British-American scholar Richard Reeves, called Dream Hoarders. We've noticed, and political dialogue in this country over the past, particularly since the 2008 financial crisis, has been, is the U.S. becoming an increasingly class-based society? Historically, class exists in all societies around the world, but Americans didn't really have much of a consciousness of it. Richard Reeves is asserting nothing short of that the U.S. is indeed a class-based society, and he says it's just as bad as the U.K. that he used to live in. It's just Americans aren't aware of it, which is a pretty astonishing statement. His book, Dream Hoarders, discusses how the top 20%, the upper middle class as he calls it, are hoarding opportunities through education, through zoning of neighborhoods, through the tax code, and through networks that parents give to their children. Anybody who's grown up in Northern Virginia, I'm speaking to someone right now who grew up in Northern Virginia and who might possibly be aware of how the immense connections that people who live in that part of the country pass on to their children. It's very important to note, entering into the labor force in the 21st century requires internships. But the other thing that Reeves talks about, the hoarding of wealth through the tax code. So we have a number of policies in the U.S. That are regressive in our tax code. But the most important is the mortgage interest tax credit, which is a handout to rich people, I'm just going to say. It gives money back to rich people who buy homes. It incentivizes them to put more money into real estate to get bigger tax breaks. And Reeves talks pretty explicitly about this policy and about how it reinforces privilege and it reinforces the divide in wealth and the building of wealth in this country. One of the last things he talks about is legacies, and we know about this well, is legacies at universities. He said even in Britain, his own, which is a very class-divided country, there is no system and has not been a system for decades where the children of people who graduated from a university are given preference for admission. And it's astonishing that the U.S. does this today. We are pretty much the only developed country that does this. So I strongly recommend the book, and he gave a great interview on NPR a few days ago.
Okay. Anything else?
Last thing, and this is the thing that nobody else in the universe is focusing on, is the Conservative Party of Canada has picked a leader.
Oh, have they?
Yes, this is not even below the centerfold. I don't even think this appeared in the newspapers, but I think it's pretty important for the reason that nobody's paying attention to it, because we know that Canadian politics is extremely boring. Canada is one of the last industrialized countries in the world that has the luxury of having boring politics.
Germany is the other.
Germany is the other one, although I think Canada is even more boring than Germany.
I agree.
After suffering a major defeat in 2015 by the Liberal Party with Justin Trudeau coming to power, the Conservative Party of Canada has been in a bit of an identity crisis. They took a long time to decide who they wanted their new leader to be and what the platform was. There was, I think, about 16 or 17 candidates who sought the leadership of the party, which is voted on by general membership of the Conservative Party.
So a Donald Trump 2016 American election number of potential candidates to lead this
but both in the outcome and in the level of excitement, it couldn't have been more different. What I would note about this, I'm not going to talk about all 17. I don't remember them, but I will talk about 4. The front runner was Maxime Bernier, who of course is from Quebec, but unlike many people in Quebec, he's a libertarian. He was the one who everybody thought was going to be the leader. He got many endorsements, he had the most resources, and he really promised to radically change the relationship between the government and the economy in Canada, particularly on tax policy and regulation. He lost very narrowly to Andrew Scheer, a social conservative from the province of Saskatchewan. Scheer was a kind of consensus candidate who promised to continue the policies of previous Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He was first called Harper Light. Scheer says he wants to be called Harper 2.0, which is to say very conservative from a Canadian point of view, not so much from an American point of view. Lower taxes, less regulation, more aggressive foreign policy than Canada is used to, but in no way nativist. And that was sort of an option in this race. There were 2 candidates who had promised a more nativist, particularly somewhat even Islamophobic route for the Conservative Party of Canada to take. The first was Kevin O'Leary, a reality TV star.
Yes, Mr. Wonderful.
Yes, Mr. Wonderful, who everyone compared to Donald Trump. I would point out that O'Leary said that he differed from Trump a lot on immigration. He didn't have as harsh a point of view on immigration, but he did say
have nearly as many Twitter followers.
Political correctness. Sorry?
He doesn't have nearly as many Twitter followers.
No, he does not. But he did lambast a culture of political correctness that appears in Canada, and he seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the race until he mysteriously dropped out toward the end and endorsed Maxime Bernier. The other was Kelly Leach, who promised...
Thomas, if Kevin O'Leary had stayed in, do you think he could have won?
I don't think he would have, because it seemed that Canadian Conservatives were more interested in sticking to what they knew, and they also wanted to have a realistic shot at getting back to government in a country, I'll remind you, where Donald Trump is exceedingly unpopular.
Thomas, second question.
Sure.
What do you think of the conspiracy theory that Kevin O'Leary dropped out of the race because he was going to get dropped from Shark Tank?
I don't know. anything is possible.
This is unsurprising. Our listeners may not know this, but Thomas only cares about shows that were made between the 1950s and the 1980s.
I generally tend to like my TV to age like good wine. This is true. So the last candidate was Kelly Leach, who kind of picked off where Kevin O'Leary left off. And she promised a quote Canadian values test for new immigrants and for guest workers in Canada, which was seen as kind of a whistle, a dog whistle
politics.
Dog whistle politics to Islamophobia. But Leach only got 7% of the vote and was eliminated pretty quickly.
That's very small.
So the Conservative Party of Canada appears to be taking a credible position. It's still likely that Justin Trudeau's probably going to stay in power for a while. He has pretty high approval rating and has been proving to be to punching above his weight in international politics, to be sure. There's a great political vacuum for him and for Angela Merkel to jump into. But nonetheless, Canada seems to have a functional political system right now. I'm very interested in why.
I believe that ends our intellectual buffet.
All right.
So thank you for listening to our podcast, and have a great rest of your week.